And Manjit Singh Desi.
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to see you in the chair, Mr. Hosey, especially for my first opportunity as a frontbench MP responding to legislation. I want to start, first of all, by thanking the Minister, not only for providing advance notice of this statutory instrument to the Shadow Secretary of Transport and myself, but also for the briefing that he offered me last week with his team and civil servants. It was valuable in providing further details of this statutory instrument and addressed some of the queries that I had, and I would like to thank them all for their time. Although this statutory instrument imposes time-limited restrictions on people's personal liberties, it is important for the reasons that the Minister has just outlined, namely to reduce the spread of coronavirus and ultimately to save lives. I agree that this is a proportionate measure to achieve those aims, and I do not think it is a particularly controversial measure. I and the Labour Party wholeheartedly share the government's aim of defeating coronavirus and protecting public health. I therefore support this SI, but I would like to take a few moments just to point a few of points of concern on record. The first point, Mr. Hosey, and perhaps the most important point from a public health perspective, is that while this is a welcome measure, it should have been implemented long before now. As Labour had consistently called for, the government have once again been too slow to act. This SI was laid in Parliament and came into force on the 15th of June. On that same day, the Foreign Secretary stated in the government's daily press briefing that across the country there were 1,056 new coronavirus cases. This figure was thankfully part of a sustained effort of declining cases and came as the Foreign Secretary was also announcing that some of the lockdown restrictions from March were being relaxed. Now, I understand that as the government relaxes lockdown restrictions, it wants to keep the infection rate low and prevent a resurgence of the virus. But why is the government only now introducing the simple step of infection control? Surely a much more sensible time to have introduced these measures was at the start of lockdown itself, months ago, when we were experiencing approximately 6,000 cases per day. Why was no effort made to introduce this then? This was a time when those using our public transport network were largely essential workers, and yet the government chose not to take this basic step to protect them from contracting coronavirus. Now, I expect that the government will say that they have been following the World Health Organization's advice, but this SI, Mr. Hosey, does not in fact follow that advice. The WHO updated their advice on the 5th of June to recommend that cloth masks made from at least 3 layers of fabric are worn by the public on public transport, in shops or in other confined or crowded environments. 10 days later, and we get this statutory instrument which is before us. It makes no mention whatsoever that the public must wear face masks which have at least 3 layers of fabric. In fact, it makes no mention of face masks at all. A t-shirt, in fact, pulled over up over one's mouth and nose, or a visor that isn't making any contact with one's mouth and nose are face coverings. And while completely fine under this SI, they are a far cry from the recommendations of the WHO. I think that in this respect, it is yet another missed opportunity to take the steps needed to protect people using public transport. On compliance, Mr. Hosey, we've seen patchy figures for those who are wearing face coverings on public transport since this measure was introduced, and so it would be good to hear how the government plans to monitor compliance and take steps to increase the number of people who wear face coverings. It is my considered view, Mr. Hosey, that enforcement of this legislation is a job for the police and not transport staff. And so I would be very grateful if the Minister could reassure me that when it comes to issuing fixed penalty notices, that this will be done exclusively by the police and perhaps Transport for London enforcement officers as applicable, but not by other transport staff. if the government do expect other transport workers to enforce these restrictions, what training and additional protections will the government be providing to keep transport workers safe from abuse in their place of work? Across the UK, Mr. Hosey, public health is a devolved matter, but there is obviously a large amount of cross-border travel on public transport, as I'm sure you will attest, Mr. Chairman. So I would ask the Minister to guarantee that the government will take a joined-up approach with the devolved governments to ensure that as passengers are travelling across borders, they are complying with the different and evolving requirements in each nation. The Minister, as he will no doubt be aware, is required to review this SI in 6 months. But I hope that before then he will consider the issues raised in today's debate, seek feedback from the police, transport unions and operators as to the impact this SI is having, and if needed, make changes sooner rather than later. In conclusion, Mr. Hosey, I realise that this is a period of some uncertainty, and the situation we are in today will probably not be the same one we are in months or even weeks from now. And so I want to reaffirm to the Minister my commitment to work with him constructively on all issues, but especially on this issue. I'm sure he'll agree with me that it's too important not to get it right. And on that note, I would like to thank the Minister and you, Mr. Hosey, for giving me the opportunity to speak. Thank you.